Hey everyone, welcome back. We've got a really interesting deep dive ahead of us today.
Yeah, should be fun.
You guys sent in a ton of material about firm behavior and market structures,
Hmm.
but you're specifically interested in production decisions.
Right.
So it looks like we're going to be cracking the code
Hmm.
of isoquants, isocosts, and all the ways that businesses figure out
Yeah,
how to make the most output without spending a fortune.
absolutely. And it's fascinating stuff when you get into it.
Okay.
And it applies to pretty much any business you can think of,
So true.
whether it's, a company cranking out pizzas or building skyscrapers.
Right.
They're all trying to find the best mix of ingredients, so to speak, to
Yeah.
maximize
Yeah.
their output.
I love that analogy. Okay, so let's start with the first ingredient in this economic recipe, isoquants. Now, I'll admit, the name sounds a bit intimidating,
Sure,
but I have a feeling you're about to make this all crystal clear for us.
I'll certainly try. So think of an isoquant, like a blueprint. Imagine you're building a house. You could use
Yeah.
lots of workers and a few power tools.
Right.
Or you could use a smaller crew, but with, some really high-tech machinery.
Uh-huh.
Either way, you can still build the same house, right?
Right.
So what the isoquant is showing us is all the different combinations of, let's say, workers and tools
Yeah.
that all result in that same finished house, that same output.
Okay, so each point on that isoquant is basically a different recipe to get to that same end product.
Exactly. Each point on that isoquant
Got it.
represents a different recipe for success, at least in terms of output.
All right, I'm following so far. But how do businesses actually decide which recipe is best for them? I mean, wouldn't you always just want to use more of everything if you could?
Well, that's where things get a little bit more interesting. More isn't always better, especially when you start to factor in things like cost.
Right, of course.
And that's where the concept of the marginal rate of technical substitution comes into play, or MRTS as it's often abbreviated.
MRTS. Okay, I'm already sensing another one of those economics terms that sounds way more complicated than
Right.
it actually is.
Yeah, they do like their jargon, don't they?
They do, they do.
But it's not that bad, really.
Lay it on me.
Think of MRTS like this. If you reduce one input, say the number of workers on your construction site,
Okay.
how much more of another input, like power tools in this case, would you need to add
Yeah.
to keep the output the same?
Oh, okay.
So you're reducing your workers, you're adding more power tools, but you still want to build that same house.
I got it. So it's all about finding that balance, that like sweet spot where you're not overspending on one input, but also not, skimping on another.
Precisely. And the shape of that isoquant actually gives us a visual clue about how these inputs interact with each other.
Interesting.
Typically, they're convex, so kind of like a bowl curving outwards.
Okay, why that specific shape? It's got to mean something.
It does. It does. It reflects a really important concept called diminishing marginal productivity.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of this.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Think about it this way. If you add one more worker to a construction site that's already swarming with people,
Right.
they might not actually boost the output as much
Yeah.
as if you added that first worker to an empty site.
Right, that makes sense.
Right. That initial worker, that's a huge difference.
Huge difference. Yeah.
But as you keep adding more and more,
Yeah.
the impact of each additional worker starts to decline a little bit.
So each additional input that you add, whether it's a worker or a tool, ends up having less and less of an impact on the final output.
Exactly. That's why the isoquant curves outwards like that.
It's like the recipe, it gets less and less effective as you keep adding the same ingredient over and over again.
Perfect analogy. You're getting it.
Right.
So we've got this output side of things figured out with our isoquants. But to really make smart decisions about production,
Yeah,
businesses also need to consider costs, right?
that makes sense. I mean, you can have the most efficient production process in the world, but if it costs a fortune, it's not going to be very sustainable for very long.
Exactly.
So I'm guessing this is where isocosts come in.
You got it. Isocost lines represent all the different combinations of inputs that a firm can afford,
Okay.
given a specific budget, and the prices of those inputs.
So if we were looking at this on a graph, the isocost line would show us all the different mixes of, say, worker hours and machine hours that a business could afford.
Right.
Like, it's like setting a budget for our construction project
Exactly.
and then
Yeah.
figuring out all the different ways we could spend that money.
That's a great way to think about it.
Cool.
And the slope of that line, that tells us about the relative prices
Uh-huh.
of those inputs. For example, let's say power tools suddenly become much cheaper.
Okay.
That isocost line is going to shift. And our construction manager
Right.
might decide, well, why don't we use more power tools and fewer workers?
Makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
And we can still stay within our budget.
So it's like businesses are using these isoquants and these isocosts like a set of economic blueprints, kind of guiding them towards the most efficient way to use their resources.
Precisely.
I love it. Okay, so how do they actually put this all together to make real-world decisions? That's what I want to know.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and that's what we're going to unpack next.
I can't wait.
We're going to explore how firms find that perfect balance between maximizing their output
Okay,
and minimizing those costs.
I'm ready. Okay, so we've got these two powerful tools, our isoquants and our isocosts. They're showing us all the different possibilities for output and then the limits that we face in terms of cost.
Right.
So it feels like we're about to uncover some secret formula for business success here. What happens next? How do we put it all together?
Yeah, you're right. It is kind of like a secret formula.
Yeah.
And in economics, we call that the least cost input combination. Yeah. So picture those isoquant and isocost lines on a graph.
Yeah.
What businesses are trying to do is find the point where that isoquant, the one representing their desired output,
Right.
just touches or is tangent to that isocost line.
Okay.
That represents their budget.
So they're trying to find the spot where they can produce as much as possible
Yes.
without going over budget.
Exactly.
It's like finding that sweet spot on a Venn diagram
Yeah.
where you've got maximum output overlapping with minimal cost.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah. Okay, so cool. We found the sweet spot, but obviously things change. So what happens when input prices go up? Like, let's say wages increase, or if suddenly technology gets cheaper. How do businesses adapt?
Well, that's what makes this whole thing so dynamic and interesting. When those input prices change, that isocost line is going to shift.
Right.
And the ideal input mix is going to have to be adjusted. So it's really how businesses stay agile.
Yeah.
And they can adapt to these constantly changing conditions in the economy.
It's almost like they're doing this like economic dance, right? Constantly adjusting their steps as the music changes around them.
I like that. Yeah.
But this isn't just some like abstract theory, right? We saw some really interesting real world examples of this in the stuff you sent over.
Yeah.
Specifically about the shipping industry.
Yeah. So Maersk, which is the world's largest container shipping company.
Huge.
Yeah, they offer a great example of this. So in order to keep their costs low,
Okay.
they've invested really heavily in these massive container ships.
Enormous.
Yeah. And they benefit from what we call economies of scale.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, basically it means the bigger the ship, the
Yeah.
lower the cost per container
Oh.
to ship things around the world.
So it's like buying in bulk, right?
It's-
You get a discount if you buy a ton of stuff at once.
That's a great way to put it.
But even with these giant ships, they still have to deal with all these fluctuating costs, right? I mean, like, fuel prices must have a huge impact on them.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's it's this constant balancing act
Yeah.
for even these huge companies like Maersk. You know, they face challenges too.
For sure.
Fuel price fluctuations can
Yeah.
really change where those isocost lines are.
Right.
And they also have to figure out how to stand out from the competition,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah.
So it's not just about costs, it's also about offering really reliable
Okay.
and efficient service.
But this is a big deal. This isn't just some far-off business thing that's happening, on container ships.
Right.
This affects all of us. It affects, like, how much stuff costs.
Exactly.
And how long we have to wait
Yep.
to get our online orders delivered.
Every time you click that buy now button,
Yeah.
you are indirectly, a part of these decisions.
I never thought of it that way, but it's so true.
But, this concept of finding that optimal mix of inputs, that's not limited to these big companies like Maersk.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
happening everywhere,
Right.
in every industry.
Like, restaurants.
Yes.
Trying to figure out how many chefs to hire
Exactly.
versus how much kitchen equipment to buy.
Absolutely.
Or like even just a small business owner figuring out how much to spend on marketing
Yeah.
versus hiring more people.
That's a constant challenge.
Yeah, it really is. But you know what? Now that we're talking about it, there's something that I'm kind of curious about.
Yeah. What's that?
So far, we've been talking about how that isocost line can shift.
Mm-hmm.
But can the isoquant, can that actually change shape too?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes.
Really?
Yeah. Remember how we talked about that shape?
Mhm.
Kind of like a bowl curving outwards,
Yeah.
and how that's determined by that principle of diminishing marginal productivity?
Right, right.
Well, if something comes along that disrupts that relationship between inputs and outputs,
Oh.
that curve can actually change.
Okay, now you've lost me. Give me an example.
Okay, so let's go back to our construction site example.
Okay.
Let's say some new technology comes along,
Mhm.
something that makes each worker much more productive, like, I don't know, some kind of robotic exoskeleton that gives
Mhm.
them, like, superhuman strength.
That would be awesome.
Right, so suddenly each worker can do, like, the work of 3 workers.
Okay.
That's really going to change things up.
Yeah, that would disrupt that balance, wouldn't it?
Exactly.
Right.
And in that case, the isoquant would probably become steeper
Okay.
because you're going to be able to substitute more of that capital, in this case the robotic exoskeletons, for labor,
Interesting.
but keep that same output.
So the recipe to build the same house
Right.
now calls for way fewer workers.
Yeah.
Because we've got this amazing new technology.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like suddenly we need way less flour to bake that same cake.
Perfect analogy.
Okay.
And this is why it's so important for businesses to, stay up to date with technology,
For sure.
because those innovations can really change everything about how production works.
Huh?
And it can even shift the balance of power between labor and capital.
Right. It's like a constant race to keep adapting and evolving.
It is.
It is. All right. Well, this is making me think about something else. We've been talking a lot about technology and automation. But what about the people? What about the workers?
Yeah.
Didn't the material you sent over touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's an important point. We can't forget about the human side of all of this.
Right.
And the material actually delves into this concept of labor productivity,
Oh, okay.
which is a huge factor in all of this.
Yeah.
And it's not just about, how hard individuals work. It's influenced by the overall economic environment.
So things like education levels, access to good tools and technology,
Okay.
maybe even things like infrastructure.
Yep, all of that.
All of that can play a role in how productive workers can actually be.
Even the most skilled and motivated worker can only do so much
Right.
if they don't have the right training,
Right.
if they don't have the right tools, if they don't have the right support.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like a chef can only make so many dishes
Exactly.
with just one burner and like a dull knife.
Yeah.
But you give them a fully equipped kitchen
Yeah.
and suddenly they can do so much more,
Absolutely.
both in terms of like how much food they can prepare
Exactly.
and also the quality of the food.
Yeah.
It's like investing in better ingredients and a better oven, right, to bake that better cake. It's not just about the baker's skill. It's about giving them the tools.
That's a great way to put it.
They need to thrive.
Yeah, and the source material talks about this fascinating dynamic between productivity, consumption, and saving.
Oh, okay.
And it's a balance
Yeah.
that can really affect the whole economy.
Okay, break this down for me. This is interesting.
So there's this inherent trade-off. If we as individuals or as a whole society consume everything we earn today,
Yeah.
we don't have anything left over to save or invest for the future.
Yeah.
But those investments are what can really lead to those future productivity gains and economic growth.
It's like choosing between buying a fancy coffee every day
Yeah.
or putting that money towards a really nice coffee maker
Right.
that will allow me to make delicious coffee at home, but for like a fraction of the cost in the long run.
Exactly.
It's like delaying gratification now
Yes.
to get bigger rewards later.
Absolutely.
I see.
And this applies at, both the individual level
Yeah.
and at the national level.
Got it.
Countries that prioritize saving and investment,
Yeah.
they tend to have much higher productivity growth over time.
Okay.
And that can lead to a higher standard of living for everyone.
That's fascinating. But that makes me wonder.
I wonder if we can actually apply some of this isoquant, isocost logic to our own lives.
Oh, interesting.
We're all trying to kind of maximize our own personal output in a way,
What do you mean?
whether it's at work,
Yeah.
in our relationships, or
Yes.
even just with our hobbies.
Right.
We all have these limited resources, right?
Like time, energy.
Exactly.
Huh?
Time, energy, money even.
What?
And we're constantly having to make decisions about how to use those resources to reach our goals.
Are you saying we should be treating ourselves like little businesses?
Well, not exactly like drawing graphs and things,
Okay.
but the idea is, they can be surprisingly relevant to our own lives.
I like that.
So instead of labor and capital, think about things like
Okay.
how many hours you spend working on that side project you've always wanted to do versus how much time you invest in, learning a new skill.
Okay, so those are my inputs.
Exactly. Let's say your goal is to write a novel, for example.
Ooh, I like that.
Your labor would be the hours that you're actually spending writing.
Uh.
Your capital might be investing in a writing course or some software to help organize your thoughts.
Got it. So my personal Isoquant would show me all the different combinations of writing time and resources that it would take to finish that novel.
Exactly. And you'd probably also want to figure out your own personal Isocost, right?
Yeah. I mean, that would represent my limits, right? Like how much free time I actually have each week or how much money I can actually afford to spend on those writing tools.
Precisely. So the idea is you want to find that sweet spot where your personal Isoquant that represents that novel you want to write
Right.
is tangent to your Isocost, which is all that time and those resources that you have.
So I need to find the point where I can write the most in the shortest amount of time and spending the least amount of money.
Yeah, well, finding the balance, right?
Yeah. That sounds kind of intense when you put it that way.
Maybe a little,
Yeah.
but I think it's also kind of empowering, right? It can help us be more mindful about how we're spending our time and our energy.
Okay, I'm into it.
So, are you more labor intensive? Do you achieve your goals through a lot of hard work and putting in a lot of hours?
Hmm.
Or are you more reliant on capital? Do you like to use tools and systems to help amplify your efforts?
Wow, I've never thought about it like that before.
That's a new way to think about things, right?
It really is. But is this really how this works for individuals? We don't exactly buy ourselves fancy new ovens like a pizza factory to become more productive, do we?
Well, maybe not literally,
Hmm.
but the idea of optimizing your inputs,
Yeah.
it still applies.
Okay.
Maybe your oven is actually just finding a writing space that helps you minimize distractions.
Right.
Or maybe it's investing in some really good noise-canceling headphones to help you focus.
Yeah, finding those things that give you like the most bang for your buck in terms of your own personal productivity.
Exactly. And just like businesses have to be flexible and adapt as the market changes,
Right.
we need to be able to do the same thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Our priorities change, we learn new skills, maybe we discover some amazing new time management hack
Totally.
that just changes everything.
So it's not just about finding the right inputs and then just sticking with them forever.
Right.
It's about always reevaluating,
Yeah.
adjusting,
Mm-hmm.
trying to find ways to become more efficient
Yep.
as our lives and our goals change.
You got it. It's like this ongoing process of learning and optimization.
Totally. I love that.
And that's one of the most valuable things you can take away from all of this.
Well, I know I learned a ton today.
Good.
We started with isoquants and isocosts. We went through real-world examples like those massive container ships.
It's amazing how these concepts
Yeah,
connect all these different things.
it is.
From giant ships to personal goals.
It is.
Yeah.
And we even found a way to apply those economic principles to our own lives.
Exactly.
Who knew economics could be so empowering? I'm feeling really inspired to go analyze my own personal production function right now.
That's the spirit. Remember, it doesn't matter if you're running a huge company or just working towards your own personal goals.
Yeah,
It's all about figuring out that balance between your inputs and outputs.
that's so true.
So keep experimenting, keep learning, keep optimizing.
This has been a really insightful deep dive.
You enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for joining us. And until next time,
It's a
keep those economic engines running.